From the second floor of the Duncan Student Center, it's time for Shamrock Sports. Austin Rooney alongside Chris Frick and Dave Korstanowski. Glad to have you with us. And guys, it was a tough week last week for the Fighting Irish against Virginia Tech. Back-to-back weeks now where the Irish have had trouble. What's the issue?
I don't know. I mean, it's a lot. I think the biggest thing is the offense. I think the defense is playing fine. They only let up 14 points last week. I think the offense just has to improve.
Chris?
Yeah, it's a lot of the play calling, a lot of the personnel on offense. We'll see how we can improve it this week.
Well, let's actually jump right into it now. Notre Dame football, of course, lost versus Michigan 45-14. Come back a 21-20 win over Virginia Tech at the last moment. They picked up the victory. What do you think the Irish need to look for, especially as far as Ian Book is concerned? Because a lot of question marks surrounding him. He had 2 touchdowns, threw 3 picks. One was luckily called back, only officially credited with 2 interceptions. Is it time to worry now with Ian Book?
I don't know. I think Ian Book, he's regressed a little bit this year. 2018, he was better in pretty much every statistical category. 68.2 completion percentage last year, down to 58.2 this year. He's got 19 touchdown passes last year, 17 this year. Passer rating is down about 15 points. I think you have to realize Ian Book came in as a 3-star recruit. He wasn't supposed to be the guy who was leading Notre Dame to a national championship. Now, with that being said, I don't like the steps back that he's taken. And it's not so much the stats that concern me, it's the eye test. Immediately when he's snapping the ball, he's running towards one sideline or the other. He's jittery. He's throwing off his back foot. I just don't think he looks very calm and composed.
Do you think that it's a result of the offensive line not being quite as strong as they were in past seasons?
I think it's partially that, and I think it's partially him. I think there were snaps against Michigan where he was immediately running to one side or the other after he gets the ball. He can't do that.
Chris?
Yeah, I think there's definitely cause for concern. I think if you look at his stats, not against teams that are Bowling Green in New Mexico, he has a 55% completion percentage, 7 touchdowns, 4 interceptions in 6 games. Not good at all. And like David mentioned, he's scrambling around a lot, and he's missing a lot of throws. In the Virginia Tech game, that one 19-yard throw to Lenzy, that ball was off target. If that's on the money, that's a potential touchdown to someone like Lenzy, who's got a ton of speed. And then he missed Komet in the end zone a bunch of times. Obviously, looked good on that last drive, but that was really the only time he looked very good in that game. So I think a lot of cause for concern. And yeah, you mentioned he wasn't meant to be the guy who was going to bring them to the national championship game. But the bottom line is he's been put into that role, and he's not delivering.
Is it time to worry regarding the turnovers as well? Again, we saw the 2 interceptions. Is that a major problem for Ian Book? Have turnovers been a problem throughout the course of his career here at Notre Dame?
I don't think nearly as much. I look especially at that Virginia Tech game. The first interception was terrible. It was a turnover in the end zone, in the red zone, excuse me. No idea who he was throwing it to. Second interception, a little bit underthrown. It's a good play by Divine Diablo for Virginia Tech to make that interception.
He had a terrific game.
And then he did. He had that fumble return, obviously. And that fumble on the goal line from Jafar Armstrong is the first running back fumble since 2015 that was lost and recovered by the other team. I don't think turnovers are as big of a thing. I think it's just offensive consistency.
Let's talk a little bit about his rushing game now, because he provides an additional component to the Notre Dame offense that the Irish really didn't have in the past, because Jafar Armstrong struggled again against Virginia Tech. They didn't have Tony Jones Jr., and Ian Book did a lot to pick up that running back spot against Virginia Tech.
Well, the thing I worry about with Ian Book, though, is I think he almost is a little bit too confident in his running abilities. I think he should be in the mindset of throwing the ball first. And I think a lot of times you see him go through that first read, he makes his first progression, and then he puts his eyes down and he runs. And that's something that he really wasn't doing last season. That was really the big thing that set him apart from Brandon Winbush. Winbush was pulling the ball down a lot and running it with it. Book was the big difference. The difference with him was he was keeping his eyes downfield. He was making those clutch throws when he had the opportunity to. This year he's not doing that. He's pulling the ball down too quickly. He's running a lot. So even though he may help us on some of those plays, I think he's making those decisions too quickly.
I think you have to look at what Ian Book was so good at last year. And the number one thing was efficiency and completion percentage. He was an accurate quarterback. That's why Notre Dame's offense was able to hold their own and go 12-0. I think this year that consistency and that accuracy is not there. When I look at his rushing ability, sure, like it's there. I don't think it's really central to his identity as a quarterback. He's a pocket passer first. I don't really think you can make too much of his running ability.
Well, let's talk a little bit more closely about what happened last week versus Virginia Tech, especially with regard to Winbush. With regard to Book. Winbush is long gone, folks. Ian Book threw for 356 yards. He had the 2 touchdowns, the 2 interceptions. Was it a good game for him? I mean, he led that game-winning drive. He showed he's still the heart and soul of this Notre Dame offense. David?
Yeah, I think it was a good game for him, but I don't think that this was like, oh, he silenced the doubters and everyone who talked bad about Ian Book, after Michigan should be shamed. Like, it was a good game. He had some plays where he didn't look great, and I think the biggest thing with Notre Dame's offense right now is the amount of third downs that they get into. Notre Dame's first and second down play calling and execution really has not been very good. They get into a lot of third and longs, like that situation there. You see a 3rd and goal from the 7, a 4th and 10 the play before that. I just think that Notre Dame's got to be more consistent offensively because really they have not had a scary offense since 2015.
Chris, what are your thoughts on
Yeah,
this game?
I don't think that it was a great game for Ian Book. I don't even know if I would say it's a good game for Ian Book, but the thing is, he's not being put in a good position by his offensive coaches. I'm really against the play calling. How many times in that game did we see Book run a run-pass option where he runs to his right, he keeps looking downfield, he looks downfield, doesn't see anything, keeps running right, and then just throws it away? That's not okay.
Let's talk a little bit more about that play calling. David, what do you see on Saturday versus Virginia Tech?
Again, I think the offensive play calling, it's just got to be more consistent. It seems like it's either bang or bust. They're either going 3 and out or they're putting together a touchdown drive. They also got some help from the refs. I mean, that should have been a third. It was a third interception that was then called back due to roughing the passer. Again, I just think that Notre Dame's offensive explosion, it really hasn't been there in the Kelly era. If you look at 2012, it was the defense that carried that team. Yeah. The only time that Notre Dame has had explosive weapons and a scary offense was 2015 with Will Fuller, Deshaun Kaiser, and EQ. I just look at this offense, it's average at best, and I think that they need some more firepower.
Let's talk a little bit about the receiving core for the Fighting Irish. Again, the 336 yards. The Irish got a couple of players going versus the Hokies last weekend. What have you seen from the receiving core throughout the season, whether it's Claypool, whether it's Komet? Are they up to par here in the ACC and around college football?
Well, I think when you say players got going, I think the big guy is Claypool. Yeah. Claypool was fantastic on Saturday. He was the one guy from the offense who I think really stepped up. And then Komet's looked good as well. I look at the receiving core, and I look at some guys who aren't getting as many opportunities. Braden Lenzy, one of the fastest guys on the team. I think one of the things, you mentioned Will Fuller's speed. Speed kills in college football. I don't understand why they're not trying to get him the ball more. Every time he gets the ball in his hands, I'm excited about what's about to happen because he can make players miss and he can outrun people, which isn't something that many players on this Notre Dame team can do. So that's one person who I'm looking at, who I want them to try to get the ball to more, and they just haven't been doing it enough, I don't think.
Yeah, I think the receiving core has been good, not great. I agree with Chris. I think the two leaders from this group are Cole Komet and Chase Claypool. If you look at Chase Claypool's play on 2nd and 8 with 1:10 left, and he had that amazing toe drag with the right foot, that's an NFL-level play, 100%. And he had a big catch on 4th down. He did have a couple drops, too, though. You can't forget that, and I think that they need to clean those up. But also Cole Komet, probably the most athletic guy on that offense. I think Book's got to keep feeding them until he gets some more confidence.
What have you seen from Chris Fink this year, a player that has been a little up and down this season? Was probably better last year.
No, he has been non-existent.
Your almost namesake?
Yeah, my almost namesake. Here's the thing about Chris Fink, right? I think that he's taking up a lot of the plays that Lenzy could be running because I think they're both slot guys. You look at that big play Lenzy had against USC, the one where he ran for 50 yards and a touchdown. I think if you run that play to Chris Fink, he gets tackled for a loss. I don't think he's fast enough. I think Lenzy's a much better guy in that position. Fink's a great leader for this team. He's a captain for the team, but I don't think he has the athleticism to match up with some of our opponents.
Well, there's a big elephant in the room right now regarding Notre Dame football, and it's a lot of chatter online about head coach Brian Kelly. And now back-to-back weeks for the Fighting Irish where they have not played up to par. It's a team that had a shot really at making the college football playoff for a moment after, I guess it was a couple of losses. And Notre Dame probably could have been in top 6 right now or so. And in a situation, if they only had one loss where they're able to make the college football playoff, that's now obviously out of the picture. What are your thoughts on Brian Kelly? Is he here in the long term? Is this sort of on the hot seat now? Where do you see him, David?
I don't put him on the hot seat. I think that if there is one coach who should be on the hot seat, it's Chip Long.
Yeah.
I think the defense has been awesome this year. Again, I go back to that. They only let up 13 points against Virginia Tech because.
What about the 45 versus Michigan?
Yeah, I understand that they didn't live up to par, stack up to par down the stretch in that game. But if you look at Brian Kelly and the culture that he's fostered here, I don't see how you can fire him a year after they made the college football playoff. And another thing, I go back to the offensive firepower that they need. Next year they have a 5-star running back and a 5-star wide receiver coming in for the first time that I can remember in the same class, and Jordan Johnson and Chris Tyree. Phil Jurkovic and Drew Pine also perhaps some optimism and some reason for hope at the quarterback position. I think if 3 years from now you're in the same spot as Notre Dame football, then I think he's probably reached his ceiling, but I'm not ready to call it yet on him.
Chris, where do you see Brian Kelly going?
Yeah, I think a lot of the frustration with Kelly obviously came from the Michigan game. People saying he's not able to win a big game, which I don't think is necessarily true. You know, last season he had big win on the road against Virginia Tech, big win at home to start the season against Michigan. But I do think that there's some cause for concern. I don't think he should be on the hot seat. But I think a lot of the frustration comes with how he's able to motivate this team. You know, I think coming off of they were embarrassed in Ann Arbor, straight up embarrassed. They looked horrible in that game. So you'd think coming back home against Virginia Tech, they'd come out with some firepower, and they really didn't. They came out, they looked flat, except on defense, like you mentioned. And Austin, I know you mentioned the 45ers against Michigan. Before that game, we had the longest streak in the FBS of games allowing under 30 points. So I think the defense has been great. But yeah, Kelly, I think it's about him motivating players in emotional situations. And I think that was one of the problems against Michigan, where his team went down and he didn't really know how to rally them.
I agree. I don't think he's a great locker room guy. Like, if you look at guys like Dabo Sweeney or Les Miles, those are locker room guys who can get 18 to 22-year-olds fired up. Yeah. I don't think Brian Kelly fits that mold, but I don't think that's a reason to fire him.
Do you think there's a problem with Brian Kelly in big games, David?
Oh, that's a loaded question. I think they need to show up better on the road. I mean, if you look at the last two really big road games, well, I guess Georgia, they showed up a lot better, but I'm thinking about Miami and I'm thinking about Michigan.
And Clemson last year.
Those kinds of blowouts cannot happen. Like, you need Clemson, I give a little bit more slack because of how good Clemson was, how much they beat Bama by, and I really don't think the score was indicative of how Notre Dame played in that game. It was indicative in the Miami game, and it was indicative in the Michigan game. Yeah. And I think that you can't lay eggs in big games like that.
Well, let's jump into the biggest news story around college football coming out this week, the first college football playoff poll, and there's a lot to talk about. Still 5 undefeated teams make up 1 through 5. Ohio State in that number 1 spot, and then, of course, there's Alabama, there's LSU, and then, of course, even beyond that, you look at teams like Ohio State, teams like Clemson, ranked 5th overall in the country, Penn State at number 4. Big-time matchup this week in Alabama and LSU. We'll get to that shortly. But first of all, I want to get your thoughts. Is Ohio State the best team in the country?
I think so. I think they've been by far the most impressive team this year. I think you can knock their strength of schedule a little bit, but they have really taken care of every opponent that they've had. I really didn't have many problems with the poll. I saw a lot of people saying that Ohio State shouldn't be ahead of LSU, that Clemson shouldn't be behind Penn State. I think the one that I probably would have flipped, I still would put Clemson at 4 ahead of Penn State at 5. The eye test says Clemson is better. Penn State obviously has the better resume. But they've only beat Michigan by 7 points. They've only beat Pittsburgh by 7.
But
they only
Clemson
beat Iowa. Hey, time out. They only beat Iowa by 5.
Settle down.
Clemson, yes, they beat UNC by 1, but then they beat Texas A&M by 2 touchdowns, and they've killed everyone else. Like, I understand you can poke holes at that UNC game, but I think if you look at the larger body of work, Clemson is a better team than Penn State.
What do you see with it?
Yeah, I like the poll overall. I agree with a lot of what you said, David. I think the problem I have right now is I agree with the top 4 overall, but I don't know. I still don't understand exactly how they're judging it. You look at Ohio State versus LSU. I think everyone would agree that LSU has the better strength of schedule. They have the bigger wins, but Ohio State gets that number 1 spot based on the eye test. But like you mentioned, you look at Penn State versus Clemson. Penn State has the bigger wins. Clemson probably passes the eye test better. In that case, Penn State gets put ahead. Obviously, it doesn't matter too much because those teams are going to knock each other off, but it's just interesting to see how they're judging this and how they're ranking teams because it's not entirely consistent.
Well, I think you hit on a point there at the end, Chris. Like, the people who are getting, worked up about this, they have to realize that the rankings almost always sort themselves out.
Yeah.
These big teams play each other. The conference championships are there for a reason. If you look at the history of the college football playoff, I can only think of really 2 major controversies with TCU Ohio State in 2014 at 4-5, and then Bama OSU in 2017 when Bama did not play in the conference championship but made the playoff over Ohio State. Really, like, if you look, I mean, even look at this week, right? Penn State is going to play Minnesota. 2 and 3 are playing each other,
Yeah.
and then Penn State has to play Ohio State 2 weeks from now. So if
They're
you're
gonna sort
Clemson, if you're Clemson and you're getting worked up that Penn State's ahead of you, there's really no reason to freak out. If you win the rest of your games, you will be in the playoff.
I think that there's no doubt about that. Notre Dame sits at 15th right now in the college football playoff poll. It's sort of where they were sitting in the AP top 25 in the coaches poll, right there, 15, 16 generally. Is that the right spot for them?
I think so. I think that's about right. I think Minnesota could jump them with a win this weekend.
Yeah.
Again, I think if you're Notre Dame, you just got to control what you can control. I wouldn't be here arguing, 15 over, they should be at 13. I don't really see a point in that, but I think that's about right.
Yeah, I don't think there's much to complain about there. I mean, once you get past that top 10, there's really not many playoff implications. You're the only team that can really make it outside of that top 10 right now is Minnesota, and they would need to go on a remarkable run to get there. If I'm a Michigan fan, I'm saying Notre Dame's one spot below us. Like, what's that about? We crushed them. But I don't think there's too much to complain about there.
Yeah, I agree.
As far as Notre Dame moving forward now, there's some questions about where the Fighting Irish are going to place, what bowl they're going to be in. There was a poll that came out last week before the game versus Virginia Tech, saying that the Irish would be in the Camping World Bowl, not exactly where they anticipated being, maybe the beginning of the season, but all hope is not necessarily lost for a New Year's Six Bowl. What are your thoughts? Starting with you, Chris, do the Irish have a chance to make a New Year's Six Bowl, and if so, which bowl are they looking at?
Oof. I don't think they have much of a chance. Hope is not entirely lost, but they need a lot to go right. I mean, this is a team now, you look at the rest of their schedule, they lost their 2 big games on the season. If they won out, their biggest win, I guess, would be on the road against Stanford. Like, this is a team, they're not going to have that big win. They don't have a conference championship. If they make a New Year's Six Bowl, I don't know. I don't see it happening, to be completely honest with you.
I don't know. I think you're counting them out a little bit too quick.
Really?
If you think about New Year's Six Bowls, right? Obviously, 4 teams make the playoff. Then you got 4 other bowl games. That's another 8 teams. If you do the math, right? Notre Dame's got to be about 12th, 13th in the country, right? Somewhere in there. And I think Notre Dame has a chance to move up because the Peach Bowl and the Fiesta Bowl are the playoff this year. If you look at the Sugar Bowl, Notre Dame won't make that because it's the SEC versus Big 12 Bowl. Yeah. The Rose Bowl is reserved for the Pac-12 versus Big 10. So that leaves 2 bowls for Notre Dame to make, the Orange Bowl or the Cotton Bowl. And if you look at the conferences that those are reserved for, the Orange Bowl is the ACC versus either the Big 10, the SEC, or Notre Dame. And then the Cotton Bowl is an at-large bid. That's where we've seen teams like UCF in the past versus a Group of 5 team. And I think that Notre Dame, if they go 10-2 and they beat Stanford, these other teams are going to lose. And the ACC is not going to be putting a team ahead of Notre Dame because Clemson will likely be in the playoffs. So Notre Dame, if you count them in the ACC, right, they're going to be that second team. To keep it short, I think that Notre Dame can sneak into the Orange Bowl because of all the chaos that's going to go on in the Big Ten. I think the Big Ten champion likely makes the playoff, so that means the second place team in the Big Ten goes to the Rose Bowl, and that likely leaves Notre Dame to sneak in to that Orange Bowl bid.
Wow, it'll be a pretty lucky break for Notre Dame, considering, Chris, your points. The Irish have lost their only 2 big games. They haven't really beaten any ranked teams yet. Who knows? Maybe Stanford comes in late with a promising season, and the Irish are able to pick up a big win there. Well, let's talk about some of the other big games on the schedule this weekend because there are a lot of them, starting with Alabama and LSU. That is the big game of the week. 2 versus 3. This is going to make big-time news as far as playoff is concerned. I'd have to imagine the winner of this game takes over number 1 in the college football playoff poll, David.
Yeah, I agree. I look at this game, and Bama has a ton of injuries. So 2 is coming back from injury right now. Their tight end, Miller Forrestall, running back, Najee Harris, and then their wide receiver, Ali Cole. I mean, they have injuries up and down their lineup. LSU right now is riding high. Joe Burrow is a Heisman candidate with already 30 touchdowns this year. And their strength of schedule, I mean, they have taken care of Texas, who is ranked in the top 10, Florida, and Auburn as well. The thing that's interesting about this game, both of these teams are coming off a bye, and I think that Alabama is going to use that more and really need that more than LSU does. I also look at the fact that it's going to be in Tuscaloosa as a slight advantage for the Crimson Tide. I think it's going to be a great game. I think it's going to be a one-possession game.
Chris, what are your thoughts on this game?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I think this is the most exciting Bama-LSU matchup since 2011, that 9-6 thriller. I think this is the best offense LSU has put on the field in years, and I think that's what makes this game so exciting. I think Joe Burrow has the potential to keep them in this game and win it on the road. Whether he does that, we'll see. But I think this is the most exciting matchup between these two teams in almost a decade.
LSU has had a tough schedule already this season. They played a couple of tough games. You saw one right there against Auburn, sneaking away with the win. They were down for most of that contest. It shows they're able to come back and play well in these big matchups.
Yeah, and I think if you're looking for a prediction, Austin, I got 28-24 Bama. I think that the fact that Tua is coming back from injury and that bye week is going to propel Nick Saban's squad to a win.
Chris, what are your thoughts on that matchup? Who takes home the victory?
I think if Tua plays, I think Bama wins. If Tua doesn't play, Bama wins by less. I think if you want to take down Bama in a big game, I think you look at these big games that Bama has lost over the past couple of years against mainly Clemson. You need a great quarterback, and LSU has that. But you also need a great coach. Dabo Swinney's a great coach. I don't know if I would necessarily classify Ed Orgeron as a great coach. I think he's a very energetic coach. I think he brings a lot of energy to his team, but I think Saban's going to out-scheme him, and I think that will lead Bama to victory in this one.
Let's move into the other big contest this week. It's a Big Ten matchup. Penn State taking on Minnesota. Minnesota, not traditionally a football powerhouse, but they found themselves undefeated here taking on Penn State. So I've got a first question here about Minnesota. Is this a team that has a real chance to push for a shot at the college football playoff? If this team goes undefeated, are they in?
Yes, if they go undefeated, are they in? Yes, I think they do, but that's not going to happen. I mean, they really have not played anyone this year. And I mean, like you look at Notre Dame, you can be like, oh, they haven't beaten anyone. Like Minnesota has played, probably their best opponent is Nebraska, who has a losing record and just lost to Purdue at home last weekend. They have a Wisconsin-style quarterback in Tanner Morgan. Like, he's okay. He can throw the ball. He takes care of the football, doesn't have a lot of interceptions. If Minnesota wants to win this game, the defense is going to have to do it for him because Penn State's offense is so explosive. I will say, one thing that does favor the Golden Gophers is the fact that this is a noon kickoff. Minnesota was offered a night game, and they turned it down. And I think that that's a smart move by P.J. Fleck because Penn State's used to playing in big-time night games. Minnesota's not. You know what Minnesota's used to? Those gross noon kickoff Big Ten games that they'll sneak out with a win.
I cannot stand those games.
I mean, that's
come on right after college football, the morning show.
Right after the morning show. And then you got to understand, too, that was when Wisconsin lost to Illinois, was a noon kickoff at Illinois. So I think that that's the one thing Minnesota has going in their favor. I think Penn State starts slow but gets a 2-touchdown win.
Yeah, I mean, I think realistically, yes, Minnesota can make the playoff, but also we're in a spot where we could still have Minnesota, Baylor, and Oregon in the playoff right now. And that's just not going to happen. I think you mentioned Minnesota. They haven't really been tested yet. Like their biggest games have been against, you mentioned Nebraska. They had a big win against Maryland last week. Like, I don't know, man.
Quality squad.
Yeah, Penn State. They had that big win against Michigan, and I think that game was closer. It looked closer than it actually was in the final scoreboard. I watched that game. Penn State dominated that one. They looked really good. They have a lot of speed on offense. I think Penn State wins this one pretty handily. You mentioned the noon kickoff does favor Minnesota because they're used to playing in those gross conditions. But I still think Penn State takes this one.
Well, we talked quite a bit about other teams around college football. Now let's hone in on Notre Dame, the Fighting Irish, taking on the Duke Blue Devils on the road in Durham. So first, let's start with some of the keys to the game. What are your thoughts on the keys for Notre Dame to just find a way to come back and, after a tough matchup against Virginia Tech, turn things around against Duke?
Well, I think the biggest challenge that Notre Dame has is this very solid Duke receiving core. They have guys like Jalon Calhoun, Scott Bracey, and Noah Gray. The thing is, they're very well spread out on offense. They have 7 players with 2 to 3 touchdowns. You look at Notre Dame, they have 3 guys that they kind of lean on with Claypool, Komet, and then their running back, Jafar Armstrong. But I think that the fact that Duke is so balanced on offense presents problems for Notre Dame's secondary, so they have to make sure that they lock down Duke's passing game.
What are the keys for Notre Dame, in your opinion, Chris?
I mean, I think if you look upon where they struggled last week, they got to get the running game going. Last week, there was really not much creativity there. Jafar Armstrong really wasn't able to get much going there. I think if they're going to succeed on Saturday, they need to get him going, and that'll hopefully open up passing lanes for Book as when the game is placed solely on Book's shoulders, he can't really carry the team that well. But if they've got a good running game and they can set up play action well, I think that bodes really well for them. I think that they need to get Armstrong going, maybe even get Jameer Smith going. That's going to be the most important part for them, I think.
As far as the Duke Blue Devils, what are their biggest strengths this week, Chris?
Well, I think the fact that they have a dual-threat quarterback in Quentin Harris. He's averaged over 4 yards a carry this season. He's accountable for 19 of their touchdowns. He's had a pretty good season so far. I think it's going to be important for them to shut down his running game, make him throw the ball. And if they can do that, I think that'll bode well for them.
Yeah, their defense is terrible. They've had 5 games letting up more than 20 points, 3 letting up more than 30. I think it's just that receiving core that they have to worry about. But if Notre Dame's offense can put up some points, they should win this game.
Talking about Notre Dame's offense, it's a big opportunity for the Fighting Irish to turn things around. They scored just 21 points against a Virginia Tech team that has a so-so defense. Yeah. Just 14 against Michigan, whose defense has also been up and down all year. Well, it was not so great, especially early in the season. They've sort of turned things around. But this is not an outstanding Michigan defense. Notre Dame put up 14 points. Is this a really big opportunity for Notre Dame to find a way to put some big points in the score on the board and prove their offense is right back where it was at the beginning of the season?
Well, they're not going to prove that it's right back where it was at the beginning of the season, even if they put up 40 points, because it's against Duke. I think that this is a good tune-up game. This is really where they have to get back to their elements and put together consistent drives one after another. No third and longs. I'm looking for 30-plus points to be impressed by this ND offense.
What would be impressive from your point of view, Chris?
Yeah, 30-plus, I agree. It's almost been embarrassing how they played on offense the last 2 weeks. I mean, they really haven't been able to get anything going. And Michigan's defense is solid. I think that they could have done more, but I do think that I don't think that's as terrible. It's a bad performance. I don't think it's as terrible as they played against Virginia Tech, only scoring 21 there. I'd say 30 or more points. I think they have to win this game by 2 scores at least for me to be somewhat impressed.
Well, let's talk about one other thing that you want to see from Notre Dame in this game against Duke. Is there one group, either the defense, the offensive line, the running backs, the wide receivers, who needs to step up this week for Notre Dame?
Now, this is the offense as a whole, but I don't want to see third and longs. I want, because Notre Dame had 20 third downs last week against Virginia Tech and then 15 the week before against Minnesota. Their third down conversion rate has not been great. I'm looking for third and shorts and manageable third down distances.
Chris?
David mentioned the wide receiving core. I think for Duke, I think it's going to be really important that Notre Dame's cornerbacks step up. When they've been tested this year, they've struggled a little bit. Troy Pride, Dante Vaughn. I think it's going to be important for those guys to play well, not picking up penalties, staying in coverage. I think it's going to be really important for Troy Pride to be able to play the ball. He's really fast, but often at times when a jump ball goes up, he has trouble locating it. I think it's going to be really important that he stays with these plays and is able to bat down some passes on Saturday.
Let's jump into the final section of our show now. It's fact or fiction time. Last week, Notre Dame had Ian Book throw for 336 yards. A pretty big week. He's got a pretty easy week against Duke coming up. Over, under 300 passing yards. Chris?
I say over. I think he has a pretty big passing game on Saturday. I think he hears a lot of the noise surrounding the program. People are chanting for Phil Dracovic in Notre Dame Stadium. And I think he wants to prove them wrong. So I think he goes for over 300 passing yards. Dave, you mentioned this Duke defense is not great. I take the over on that.
I take the over as well, not because of Ian Book, but because of the Duke defense. I think it would be bad if he didn't throw for over 300.
Now into the running game. Will the Notre Dame rushing offense as a whole, not including Ian Book, rush for more than 150 yards?
I would say yes. I'm going fact on that. I think that one guy will not surpass 100 yards, but I think that the whole running back core, Jameer Smith, I think is going to get a lot of touches this week. I say yes.
Yeah, I agree as well. I think maybe one guy, maybe Armstrong surpasses 100. I don't think he surpasses 150 by himself, but I think you add in Jameer Smith there. I think they get to over 150. We've talked about this Duke defense a lot at this point. So yeah, I think they get over 150. I think this is going to be a big week for the offense.
I'm going to go under 150. I see a lot of passing yards, maybe not quite as much on the ground for the Fighting Irish this week. Our final fact or fiction is with regard to the turnovers. Now, Notre Dame had 2 turnovers in the passing game with Ian Book. Should have had a third if it wasn't called back due to roughing the passer. And then, of course, the 98-yard fumble recovery to the house from Virginia Tech. So that was 3 turnovers, easily could have been 4. We're going to set the bar a little bit lower this time around. Only a turnover and a half, over or under this time around. David, we're starting with you.
I'm going over.
Okay.
I am still not confident in this offense. I think maybe an interception and a fumble. I think 2 turnovers. I think that they'll probably be a little bit sloppy at the beginning of this game. I think Duke will be fired up and probably force a turnover or 2. So I'm going over.
I'm taking the under on this one. I think this offense has struggled in a lot of facets, but I don't think turnovers have really been one of their main issues. It was a big problem on Saturday against Virginia Tech, no doubt about that. But I think overall, they haven't struggled too much with turnovers. I think it's going to be really important for them not to turn the ball over, especially it being a road game. But I think I take the under on that one. I think they turn it over 0 or 1 time at most.
I think we see maybe 1 turnover, no fumbles this time around. I see maybe an interception from Ian Book. Now, to the score predictions. Notre Dame and Duke. We're starting with you this time around, Chris.
All right.
Who takes home the victory, and what's your final score?
I think Notre Dame takes it home. I think Ian Book plays pretty well. I think we get the running game going. I'm going to take a final score of this one of 33-14.
I got 30-17 Notre Dame. Again, I think they probably come out a little bit slow at the beginning, get going in the 3rd and 4th quarters, win by about 2 touchdowns.
It's a dominant performance. Notre Dame 35, Duke 10. That'll do it for us this week with Shamrock Sports. Thanks so much for watching. Be back next week right here in the Duncan Student Center.